The shrill metallic groan of a train horn echoed through the desolate stretch of tracks cutting through the outskirts of Gainesville, Florida. It was a gray, drizzling afternoon, one of those quiet, forgotten days where the world seemed to exist in muted tones. Yet amidst the suffocating stillness, a horrifying scene unfolded that would shock and move even the coldest of hearts. There, tethered tightly to the rusty, weather-beaten tracks, was a pregnant cat. Her fur, a striking blend of snowy white, stormy gray, and sunlit orange, clung to her small frame, soaked by the relentless drizzle. Her wide, terrified eyes darted in all directions as she struggled against the cruel rope that cut into her delicate body. Her swollen belly heaved with each panicked breath, a silent testament to the tiny lives she carried within her. The train was still far enough away for its rumble to be faint, but the vibrations beneath her paws told her time was slipping away. This wasn't a cruel twist of fate or a tragic accident. It was deliberate. Someone had done this, tied her here, left her to face an unspeakable end. And now she was utterly alone, her cries drowned out by the wind and the distant hum of approaching steel. A few miles away at the edge of town, 34-year-old Ethan Reynolds stood outside his modest workshop, gazing at the overcast sky. Ethan was a mechanic by trade, a solitary figure who had built his life around fixing things, engines, motors, anything with a pulse of machinery. But since the untimely death of his wife, Clara, 2 years ago, he'd poured himself into his work as a way to numb the aching void that consumed him. His only real companion now was Rosie, his loyal golden retriever, who followed him everywhere with her wagging tail and soulful eyes. Ethan wasn't the type to believe in signs or fate, but something about today, the strange stillness, the heavy air, felt different. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, though he didn't know what or why. Across town, little Maisie Harrington, an 11-year-old girl with a wild mop of curly hair and a heart bigger than her tiny frame, was pedaling her bike along the same stretch of tracks. Maisie had always been a dreamer, an animal lover who spent her afternoons rescuing stray dogs and nursing injured birds back to health. She had begged her mom to let her explore the outskirts of town that day, promising to stay away from danger. But as her bike skidded to a stop at the sound of a faint, desperate cry, she realized she was about to break that promise. It was the cat's voice that Maisie heard first. A strangled, mournful wail that pierced through the drizzle like a beacon. She dropped her bike and sprinted toward the sound, her heart pounding as she spotted the trembling creature struggling against the ropes. For a moment she froze, paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of the sight. Then, without hesitation, she dropped to her knees, her small hands trembling as she tried to untie the knots. The rope was old and frayed but cruelly tight, and Maisie's fingers were too small, too weak to free the cat in time. She glanced up in terror at the horizon where the faint silhouette of the train began to emerge, growing larger, louder. The cat cried louder, her instincts screaming that danger was coming. Meanwhile, Rosie, Ethan's golden retriever, perked up her ears as she stood by her owner's side. A low whimper escaped her throat as she tugged at Ethan's pant leg, desperate to get his attention. "What is it, girl?" Ethan asked, crouching to scratch behind her ears, but Rosie wouldn't stop. She barked insistently, her golden eyes darting toward the direction of the tracks. Something in her behavior struck Ethan as strange, urgent. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his truck keys and whistled for Rosie to hop into the passenger seat. As Ethan's truck rumbled down the back road, guided by Rosie's unrelenting focus, Maisie was still struggling. Tears streamed down her face as she fought to loosen the knot, the deafening rumble of the train now shaking the ground beneath her feet. The cat's wide eyes locked onto Maisie's, as though begging her to hurry, to do something, anything, to save her and her unborn kittens. The train's horn blared, closer now, its hulking mass barreling toward them with unstoppable force. Maisie screamed for help, her voice swallowed by the roar of the engine. Just as she was about to lose all hope, headlights cut through the mist. Ethan's truck screeched to a halt, and he leapt out, his heart slamming against his ribs as he took in the sight before him. Rosie bounded out after him, barking furiously as if to spur them into action. Without wasting a second, Ethan sprinted toward Maisie and the cat, his mind racing. "Get back! he shouted, his voice carrying an authority that Maisie couldn't ignore. She stumbled backward as Ethan dropped to his knees, his strong hands working frantically to untie the rope. It was soaked through and stubborn, resisting every tug. The train's horn blared again and Ethan's head shot up. There was no time. "Rosie," he called, his voice desperate. The golden retriever dashed forward as though she understood exactly what was needed. She clamped her jaws around the rope, pulling with all her strength as Ethan worked from the other end. Maisie stood frozen, her small hands clasped together in silent prayer. Finally, with a loud snap, the rope gave way. Ethan scooped the trembling cat into his arms just as the train thundered past, so close the wind from its wake nearly knocked him off his feet. The three of them, man, dog, and girl, collapsed onto the grass, panting and shaking but alive. As the train disappeared into the distance, Ethan looked down at the fragile creature in his arms. The cat stared up at him with wide, grateful eyes, her body still trembling but alive. Maisie knelt beside him, gently stroking the cat's fur, her tears now a mix of relief and overwhelming emotion. "We've got you," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with unspoken feelings. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of purpose, of hope. Rosie nuzzled the cat gently, her tail wagging as though to reassure her that she was safe now. But this was only the beginning of their story. The cat, the kittens she carried, and the people who had come together to save her were about to embark on a journey that would change all their lives forever. Ethan stood under the shelter of the workshop's awning, his arms still wrapped around the trembling cat. Her fur was damp, her breath shallow, but she was alive. Maisie hovered close, refusing to leave until she knew the cat was safe. Rosie sat at Ethan's feet, her warm golden gaze darting between the cat and her human, sensing the tension that still hung heavy in the air. Maisie's voice broke the silence first. "What's going to happen to her? To her kittens?" Her voice wavered with concern as she reached out to gently stroke the cat's side. Ethan sighed, his thumb absently rubbing the cat's ear in an attempt to comfort her. He didn't have an answer. "She's going to need care," Ethan said after a moment, his voice low but steady. "And I mean real care. Vet care. That's not something I'm exactly set up for." "I have some money saved," Maisie offered quickly, her big eyes pleading. "From babysitting and stuff. We can take her to the animal clinic in town, right? They'll help, won't they?" Ethan stared at her, a little taken aback by the girl's determination. She couldn't have been more than 11, yet she had the kind of fierce compassion that made grown men like him feel small. He nodded. "We'll figure it out." The veterinary clinic in town was small but clean, run by Dr. Amanda Hollis, a warm and meticulous woman in her 40s who had dedicated her life to animals. When Ethan and Maisie burst through the doors, dripping wet and carrying the pregnant cat, Dr. Hollis didn't ask too many questions. The sight of the frightened animal was enough to spur her into action. "She's severely dehydrated and stressed," Dr. Hollis murmured, her hands moving quickly as she examined the cat. "But she's a fighter. And those kittens," she paused, placing a gentle hand on the cat's swollen belly. "They're hanging in there, but it's going to be touch and go. She's close to term, but the stress could cause complications." Maisie's lip trembled as she asked, "Will she be okay?" Dr. Hollis glanced at her, then at Ethan, her expression serious but not hopeless. "We'll do everything we can, but she'll need a quiet, safe place to recover. Somewhere she can feel secure when it's time to give birth." Ethan swallowed hard. His workshop wasn't exactly a home. It was more of a sanctuary for broken machines and lost causes. He hadn't had a proper bed or a dinner table since Clara died, and he certainly didn't have the warmth of a family to offer. But as he looked at the cat, now nestled in a soft blanket, something shifted in him. "I'll take her," he said, his voice firm. Maisie turned to him, her face lighting up with gratitude. "You'll keep her safe?" she asked, almost as though she were making him swear an oath. "I'll keep her safe," Ethan promised. Back at the workshop, Ethan set up a small corner for the cat, a soft bed made from an old blanket, a bowl of water, and the food Dr. Hollis had given him. Rosie sat nearby, her head tilted as if keeping watch over her new feline friend. Maisie helped, arranging the blankets and carefully pouring the water. The cat, who Maisie quickly decided to name Hope, remained wary at first, her large green eyes scanning every movement. But as the hours passed, her trust began to grow. She allowed Maisie to gently pet her and even nuzzled Rosie's snout, her gratitude evident in the small, tentative purrs that emerged from her chest. But the next few days were far from easy. Hope's condition was fragile, and Ethan quickly realized he was in over his head. Late one night, as a storm raged outside, Hope let out a low, distressed cry. Ethan rushed to her side, his heart pounding as he watched her pace restlessly, her belly contracting. "She's in labor," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a freight train. He grabbed his phone and dialed Dr. Hollis's number with trembling hands. The vet talked him through what to expect, her calm voice steadying his nerves as the storm howled outside. Maisie, who had refused to go home since the rescue, woke up to the sound of Hope's cries. She rushed to the makeshift nursery, her face pale but determined. "What do we do?" she asked, clutching Ethan's arm. "Stay calm," Ethan said, though his own voice betrayed his fear. For hours, they stayed by Hope's side, whispering words of encouragement and stroking her fur as she fought to bring her kittens into the world. The first arrived just before dawn, a tiny ball of fur no bigger than Ethan's palm. Then another, and another. By the time the storm began to ease, Hope had delivered 5 kittens, each one more precious than the last. But as the sun began to rise, it became clear that not all was well. The smallest of the kittens, a little orange one with a white-tipped tail, was struggling to breathe. Ethan's chest tightened as he scooped up the tiny creature, his calloused hands trembling. Dr. Hollis had warned him this might happen. "Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we can't save them all," she'd said. But Ethan wasn't ready to give up. "Come on, little guy," he whispered, his voice cracking as he gently rubbed the kitten's tiny chest. "Fight." Maisie sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she whispered her own encouragement. Rosie, sensing the tension, rested her head on Ethan's knee, her warm presence grounding them all. For what felt like an eternity, they fought for that fragile life. And just as Ethan was beginning to lose hope, the kitten let out the smallest, weakest squeak. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "He's breathing," Maisie cried, her voice breaking with relief. Ethan slumped back, cradling the kitten in his hands as a tear slipped down his cheek. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something beyond grief. This wasn't just a life saved. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was still room for hope. Over the next few days, Ethan and Maisie worked tirelessly to care for Hope and her kittens. Each one began to grow stronger, their tiny cries filling the workshop with a kind of life. Ethan found himself smiling more, laughing even, as Maisie's boundless energy and Rosie's gentle loyalty transformed his once lonely space into something that almost felt like home. But there were still questions that haunted him. Who had tied Hope to those tracks? And why? Ethan couldn't shake the thought that someone out there had deliberately tried to snuff out these fragile lives. It gnawed at him, fueling a quiet anger that simmered beneath the surface. For now, though, he focused on the task at hand, protecting this little family and giving them the chance they deserved. The days that followed brought a fragile sense of peace to Ethan's workshop. Hope grew stronger with each passing hour, her kittens nursing contentedly as their tiny bodies filled out and their fur began to take on soft, distinct patterns. Maisie visited every day after school, carrying bags of supplies she had begged her mother to buy: kitten formula, blankets, toys. Even Rosie seemed to sense the importance of her presence, standing guard over Hope and her kittens like a silent, watchful sentinel. But the question of how Hope had ended up tied to those train tracks lingered, an unanswered shadow that refused to fade. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the image in his mind, the frayed rope biting into her body, the helpless terror in her eyes as the train barreled toward her. Someone had done this on purpose. Someone had meant for her and the lives she carried to die. And then, one cold January morning, Ethan got his first clue. It started when Maisie noticed something strange. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the workshop, a kitten perched precariously on her lap while she giggled at its tiny attempts to pounce. Hope rested nearby, her green eyes half closed in that serene way mothers watched over their young. Rosie lay sprawled in her usual spot, her golden fur warmed by the sunlight streaming through the window. "Hey, Ethan," Maisie said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Did you notice this before? She held up the piece of rope they had untied from Hope's body. Ethan hadn't thought much of it since that day. He'd tossed it aside, wanting to forget. But now, as Maisie held it out to him, something about it caught his eye. It wasn't just any rope. It was thick and unusually coarse, the kind used for heavy-duty work. But what struck Ethan most was the faint marking printed along its length. Words, faded but still legible. Miller Feed and Supply Co. Ethan's brow furrowed as he took the rope from Maisie's hands. Miller Feed and Supply, that's the old feed store near the tracks, isn't it? Maisie nodded. Yeah, my dad gets hay for our horses there sometimes. It's kind of run down, though. I think Mr. Miller's son runs it now. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't believe in coincidences. Whoever had tied Hope to the tracks might have gotten this rope from that store. It was a slim lead, but it was all he had. I'm gonna check it out, he said, grabbing his jacket. Maisie jumped to her feet. I'm coming with you. No way, Ethan said firmly. This might not be safe. Maisie crossed her arms, her chin jutting forward in defiance. I found the rope. I saved Hope. I deserve to know what happened to her. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the determination in her eyes. Maisie wasn't just a kid. She was brave, capable, and fiercely protective of the animals she loved. He sighed. Fine, but you stay close, and you don't say a word unless I say it's okay. Got it? Got it? Maisie grinned. Rosie barked once, her tail wagging as if to say, don't forget me. All right, girl, Ethan said, scratching behind her ears. You can come too. Miller Feed and Supply was a small, weathered building on the edge of town, surrounded by sagging fences and piles of discarded machinery. The air smelled faintly of hay and motor oil. As Ethan parked his truck, Maisie's excitement dimmed, replaced by an unease that mirrored Ethan's own. The store was quiet when they entered, the dim lighting casting long shadows over shelves stocked with feed bags and farming supplies. A man in his late 20s stood behind the counter, his lanky frame leaning lazily against the register. He looked up as they approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. Can I help you? He asked, his tone indifferent. Ethan cleared his throat. Yeah, I was wondering if you sell this kind of rope. He placed the piece of rope on the counter, watching the man's reaction carefully. For a split second, something flickered in the man's eyes. Recognition, maybe? But it was gone so quickly, Ethan almost doubted he'd seen it. Yeah, we sell rope like that, the man said with a shrug. Why? Maisie stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. A cat was tied to the train tracks with this rope. The man's gaze snapped to her, then back to Ethan. What are you accusing me of? He demanded, his voice sharp. No one's accusing you of anything, Ethan said calmly, though his tone carried an edge. We're just trying to figure out who did this. That cat had kittens. If we hadn't found her in time, they all would have died. The man's face hardened. I don't know anything about a cat. He pushed the rope back toward Ethan. Now, if you're not buying anything, I think you should leave. Maisie started to protest, but Ethan placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Come on, he said. As they turned to leave, Rosie let out a low growl, her hackles raised. Ethan glanced back to see the man watching them intently, his jaw clenched. Ethan made a mental note of the name stitched onto the man's shirt. Kyle. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in the dimly lit workshop watching Hope and her kittens as they slept peacefully. The tiny orange one, the one who had nearly died, was curled up next to Rosie, his small body rising and falling with each breath. Ethan's mind raced. Kyle knew something. He was sure of it. But proving it would be another matter entirely. He didn't have any evidence, just a gut feeling that wouldn't let him rest. Maisie's voice startled him out of his thoughts. What are we going to do? She asked, her face pale in the soft light. Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, but he couldn't lie either. We're going to protect them, he said finally, nodding toward Hope and her kittens. No matter what. Maisie nodded solemnly. And if that man tries to hurt them again? Ethan's jaw tightened. He won't get the chance. The next morning, Ethan decided to take a stand. He called Dr. Hollis, explaining everything they had discovered, and asked for her help. She agreed to report the incident to Animal Control, who would investigate further. Meanwhile, Ethan installed locks on the workshop doors and set up a small camera to keep watch over the nursery. Maisie painted a wooden sign and hung it above the kitten's bed. It read, Hope's Corner. We'll keep them safe. Maisie said as she stepped back to admire her work. "We won't let anything happen to them." Ethan glanced down at Hope, who stared back at him with her calm, steady gaze. "You're right," he murmured. "We'll keep them safe. All of them." The first sign that something was wrong came on a cold February night. The workshop was quiet, save for the gentle purring of Hope as her kittens nursed and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the stillness. Ethan had just finished checking the locks and cameras before settling into his cot in the corner of the workshop, Rosie stretched out at his feet as always. Maisie had gone home earlier, reluctantly agreeing to let Ethan handle the late-night watch. The air felt heavy that night, the kind of oppressive stillness that made even Rosie restless. Her ears perked up at the faint crunch of gravel outside. Ethan stirred, his heart quickening as Rosie let out a low, warning growl. Someone was there. Ethan grabbed the baseball bat he kept near the door and quietly made his way toward the window. Peering out, he spotted the silhouette of a man moving in the shadows near the workshop's back entrance. His blood ran cold as the figure crouched down, fiddling with something near the lock. "Kyle," Ethan muttered under his breath. Without hesitation, Ethan threw open the door, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The man froze, then bolted. Ethan sprinted after him, the bat gripped tightly in his hands. Rosie followed, her barks echoing in the night. The chase didn't last long. Kyle wasn't fast, and Ethan tackled him to the ground near the edge of the property. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Ethan growled, pinning Kyle's arms. Kyle struggled, his face twisted with anger and fear. "It's just a stupid cat," he spat. "Why do you even care?" Ethan's grip tightened. "That stupid cat has more courage and heart than you'll ever have," he hissed. "And if you come near her or her kittens again, you'll regret it." Kyle sneered, but there was fear in his eyes. "You don't understand. My dad, he's been losing money for years. The stray cats around the feed store, they attract pests, they ruin business. My dad told me to get rid of them, so I—" He hesitated, then looked away. "I tied her to the tracks. Figured it'd be quick." Ethan's stomach churned. The sheer callousness of it made his skin crawl. He wanted to hit Kyle to make him feel the pain he'd almost caused, but he knew that wasn't the answer. Instead, he pulled Kyle to his feet and shoved him toward the road. "You stay away from here," Ethan said coldly. "And you tell your father that if he's got a problem, he can come talk to me." Kyle nodded mutely before stumbling away into the night. The next morning, Ethan filed a report with the local sheriff's department. Kyle and his father were fined for animal cruelty, and Animal Control launched an investigation into the conditions at Miller Feed and Supply. It wasn't the kind of justice Ethan had hoped for, but it was something. At the very least, Kyle wouldn't be able to harm another animal anytime soon. As the days turned into weeks, a new sense of calm settled over the workshop. Hope and her kittens thrived, their tiny bodies growing stronger with each passing day. Maisie visited every afternoon, her laughter filling the space as she played with the rambunctious kittens. Even Ethan found himself smiling more often, the heaviness in his chest slowly lifting as the little family brought light back into his life. He and Maisie decided to name the kittens together. The tiny orange one with the white-tipped tail became Lucky, a name Maisie said suited him perfectly. The others were named Socks, Poppy, Ash, and Tilly. Each had their own personality. Socks was bold and adventurous, Poppy was sweet and shy, Ash was mischievous, and Tilly was as curious as could be. Hope, ever the watchful mother, grew more trusting with each day. She often curled up on Ethan's lap in the evenings, her purring a soothing balm for his once aching heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Maisie turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Hope knows we saved her?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan glanced at Hope, who was lying on her side with Lucky curled against her. Her green eyes met his, calm and unblinking. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think she does, and I think she's grateful." Maisie smiled, her hand resting gently on Rosie's head. "I'm grateful too," she said. Ethan looked at her, surprised. "For what?" "For you," she said simply. "For helping her when no one else would. For giving her and her kittens a chance." Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't realized just how much Maisie's words and her presence meant to him until that moment. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. As spring approached, Ethan began to think about the future. He knew he couldn't keep all the kittens as much as he loved them. Maisie had already begged her parents to let her adopt Socks, and Poppy was spoken for by a kind woman who worked at the animal clinic. But the thought of saying goodbye to the little family filled him with a bittersweet ache. When it came time to find homes for the rest, Ethan made sure each one went to someone who would love and cherish them. By the time the last kitten left, only Hope and Lucky remained. Ethan couldn't bring himself to part with them. Hope had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't expected, and Lucky's tiny, miraculous survival felt like a gift he wasn't ready to let go of. Months passed, and the workshop transformed. What had once been a cold, lonely space was now filled with life. Hope and Lucky had claimed the sunniest spots as their own, while Rosie remained the gentle protector she'd always been. Maisie continued to visit, her bond with Ethan growing stronger with each day. One warm evening, as Ethan watched Lucky chase a moth across the workshop floor, he realized something profound. Hope hadn't just been saved that day on the tracks, she had saved him too. She had reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there was still room for love, for trust, for second chances. Ethan glanced down at Rosie, who wagged her tail as if she understood. "We've come a long way, haven't we, girl?" he murmured. Rosie barked softly, and Ethan smiled. The kittens may have been small, fragile things, but their arrival had changed everything. Hope's story, their story, was one of survival, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. It was a story Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that even when the odds seemed insurmountable, there was always a reason to keep fighting. It was a year to the day since Ethan, Maisie, and Rosie had rescued Hope from the train tracks. The workshop, once a quiet refuge for a solitary man, now pulsed with warmth and life. Hope sat perched on the windowsill, her white, gray, and orange fur glowing in the golden light of the setting sun. Lucky, now a confident, playful cat with a streak of mischief in his bright eyes, curled up beside her, his purrs audible even across the room. Rosie lay on her usual spot by the door, her head resting on her paws, ever watchful over her little family. Ethan stood by the workbench, wiping his hands with a rag. He paused, leaning against the edge as his eyes wandered to the scene before him. It wasn't just a cat he had saved that day. It was something deeper. He had saved himself. Hope had come into his life when he needed her most, and she had reminded him what it meant to care, to fight, to believe in the possibility of light even in the darkest moments. Maisie's laughter broke his thoughts. She was sprawled on the floor, giggling as Lucky batted at the shoelace she dangled before him. "He's gotten so big," she said, glancing up at Ethan. "Do you think he remembers what happened?" Ethan smiled softly. "I think he remembers the love that came after," he said. "And that's what matters." Maisie nodded, her face bright with a wisdom beyond her years. "Hope brought us all together, didn't she?" she said quietly. "Without her, we wouldn't have this." Ethan's chest tightened. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "She did." For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching as Hope and Lucky curled into each other. The air was still, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of quiet peace that came from knowing you'd done something good, something that mattered. Hope's story became more than a memory. It became a lesson etched into Ethan's heart. It reminded him, and everyone who heard it, that every life, no matter how small, is worth saving. And sometimes, in saving another life, you save your own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan whispered a silent promise to the little family he'd fought so hard to protect. "You'll always be safe here. Always." And for the first time in years, Ethan felt whole.